For 2 years, the war in the mountains had been a stalemate, a grueling, bloody exchange of inches along the Isonzo River. But in 1917, the rules were about to change. Today, we witness a textbook military disaster, executed with surgical precision. A sudden, unstoppable Central Powers attack that shattered the Italian front line and sent an entire army reeling back 100 miles. This is the battle where infiltration tactics proved revolutionary, where a nation stood on the brink of surrender. This is the Battle of Caporetto. In the autumn of 1917, while the world's attention remained fixed on the grinding horror of the Western Front, on the mud of Passchendaele, on the killing fields of Verdun and the Somme, another drama was unfolding in a theater of war that history has often overlooked. This was the Italian front, where Italian and Austro-Hungarian armies faced each other across some of the most unforgiving terrain in all of Europe. And here, on October 24, 1917, near a small town called Caparetto, the Central Powers would deliver one of the most devastating blows of the entire war, a breakthrough so complete, so catastrophic in its execution, that it nearly knocked Italy out of the war entirely. This is the story of the Battle of Caporetto, a battle of innovation, of collapse, and of desperate survival. To understand Caparetto, one must first understand the Italian front itself, a place utterly unlike the trenches of France and Flanders. Where the Western Front was characterized by mud, shell craters, and endless flat horizons, the Italian front was dominated by mountains. The frontier between Italy and Austria-Hungary ran through the Julian Alps and the Dolomites, jagged peaks rising thousands of feet above sea level, separated by deep valleys and swift-flowing rivers. The Isonzo River, which would give its name to 12 separate battles, carved through this landscape in a roughly north-south direction, creating a natural defensive barrier that the Austro-Hungarians exploited ruthlessly. Fighting in these mountains was a unique form of warfare, unlike anything experienced elsewhere on the Western Front. Soldiers fought at altitudes where the air was thin, where winter temperatures dropped far below zero, where avalanches and rockfalls killed as many men as enemy fire. They dug trenches not into mud but into solid rock, using pneumatic drills and explosives. They hauled artillery pieces up narrow mountain paths using teams of mules or simply human muscle. They fought for possession of peaks and ridges, not because they had strategic value in themselves, but because whoever held the high ground controlled the valleys below. And in winter, the front became a frozen hell. Soldiers suffered from frostbite, hypothermia, and snow blindness. Units were sometimes cut off for weeks by snowstorms, running out of food and ammunition, surrounded by the frozen bodies of their comrades. The elements killed as efficiently as any weapon. Italy had entered the war in May 1915, lured by promises of territorial gains, specifically the Austro-Hungarian territories along the Adriatic coast and in the Alps that Italy claimed as rightfully Italian. But what Italian planners expected would be a swift, victorious campaign had instead become a brutal stalemate. The Italian commander-in-chief was General Luigi Cadorna, a stern, uncompromising officer who believed in discipline above all else. Cadorna's strategic vision was straightforward: attack, break through the Austro-Hungarian lines, capture the port city of Trieste, and push on to Vienna itself, forcing Austria-Hungary out of the war. The problem was that the Austro-Hungarians held virtually all the high ground. Their defensive positions were superb: fortified mountain peaks, interlocking fields of fire, artillery positioned where it could command entire valleys. Attacking these positions meant climbing uphill, often across bare rock, under machine gun and artillery fire, with no cover and limited artillery support of one's own. And yet Cadorna attacked. Again, and again, and again. Between June 1915 and August 1917, the Italian army launched 11 separate offensives along the Isonzo River. These became known simply as the 1st, 2nd, 3rd Isonzo, through to the 11th Isonzo. Each followed the same basic pattern: massive artillery preparation, infantry assault up the valleys and slopes, initial gains, Austro-Hungarian counterattacks, and then stalemate, with both sides holding roughly the same positions they had started with. The casualties were appalling. The Italian army suffered approximately 600,000 casualties in these 11 battles, killed, wounded, captured. The Austro-Hungarians lost perhaps 400,000. And the front line barely moved. A few miles gained here, a mountain peak captured there, but no breakthrough, no decisive victory, nothing to justify the enormous sacrifice. Cadorna's response to these failures was to blame his soldiers and his subordinate commanders. He relieved officers wholesale, sometimes on the spot, for failing to achieve impossible objectives. He instituted brutal disciplinary measures. Soldiers who showed cowardice or hesitation were court-martialed and shot. Entire units that broke under fire were subjected to decimation, the ancient Roman punishment where 1 man in 10 was selected by lot and executed by his own comrades. The Italian soldier by 1917 was exhausted, demoralized, and increasingly resentful. Many came from Italy's poorest regions, peasant conscripts who had been torn from their farms and sent to die in the mountains for objectives they did not understand, led by officers they did not trust, under a commander who treated them with contempt. Desertion rates climbed. Morale plummeted. The army was a fragile instrument, held together more by fear than by any sense of purpose or loyalty. And yet, the Austro-Hungarians were in no better shape. They had survived the 11 Isonzo offensives, but just barely. Their army was exhausted, undersupplied, and spread dangerously thin across multiple fronts, fighting the Italians in the Alps, the Russians in the east, and maintaining occupation forces in Serbia and Romania. After the 11th Battle of the Isonzo in August-September 1917, where Italian forces had made significant gains and captured ground that threatened key Austro-Hungarian positions, the Habsburg High Command recognized that they could not withstand another major Italian offensive. They needed help. And so they turned to their German allies and made a desperate request: send us reinforcements, send us your best troops and your most experienced commanders, and help us deliver a knockout blow to the Italians before they knock us out of the war. Germany agreed, and the stage was set for Caparetto. In September 1917, German reinforcements began arriving on the Italian front. These were not ordinary troops. These were elite formations, alpine and mountain warfare specialists, veterans of the Eastern and Western fronts, trained in the newest German tactical doctrines. Among them were units of Alpenkorps, mountain troops who had fought in the Carpathians and the Alps, and Jager battalions, light infantry trained for rapid movement and independent action. The Germans brought with them not just manpower but expertise. They brought new tactics, new weapons, and new leadership that would transform the coming offensive from another costly slog into a devastating breakthrough. Command of the combined Austro-German force was given to General Otto von Below, an experienced German commander who had fought on both the Eastern and Western fronts. The attacking force was designated the 14th Army, a mixed force of German and Austro-Hungarian divisions, totaling approximately 350,000 men. They would attack the Italian Second Army, commanded by General Luigi Capello, which held the northern section of the Isonzo front around the town of Caparetto, known in Slovenian as Kobarid. The plan was ambitious. Rather than the grinding, attritional offensives that had characterized previous fighting on the Italian front, this would be a blitzkrieg, a lightning war. The objective was not to capture territory slowly through sustained pressure, but to shatter the Italian defensive system, to penetrate deep into the rear areas, to disrupt command and control, and to create such chaos and panic that the Italian army would collapse before it could recover. Central to this plan was a new tactical doctrine that the Germans had been developing and refining throughout 1917. Infiltration tactics, sometimes called Stormtrooper tactics or Hutier tactics, after General Oskar von Hutier, who had used them successfully on the Eastern Front. The traditional approach to breaking through enemy lines had been to attack along a broad front with massed infantry, attempting to overwhelm the defender through sheer numbers. But this approach had proven suicidal against modern defensive firepower. The new doctrine was different. It emphasized speed, surprise, and flexibility. Rather than advancing in waves across a broad front, Stormtrooper units, small groups of specially trained soldiers carrying light weapons, grenades, and flamethrowers, would infiltrate through gaps in the enemy line. They would bypass strong points rather than attacking them directly. Their objective was not to capture ground but to penetrate as deeply as possible into the enemy rear, to capture or destroy headquarters, communication centers, artillery positions, and supply dumps. Meanwhile, conventional infantry following behind would isolate and reduce the bypass strong points. The defenders, cut off from their command structure and supplies, surrounded and confused, would surrender or be destroyed piecemeal. The enemy line would not be battered down through brute force, it would be dissolved from within. To support this tactical approach, the Germans brought artillery in unprecedented concentration. Not just conventional high-explosive shells, but something new and terrifying, gas shells filled with phosgene and other chemical agents. These would be used in the opening bombardment to neutralize Italian artillery batteries and strongpoints without the noise and destruction of conventional high-explosive fire, preserving surprise and leaving infrastructure relatively intact for the attackers to use. Through September and early October, German and Austro-Hungarian forces moved into position. The build-up was done carefully, using roads and valleys that were out of sight of Italian observation posts. Artillery was positioned at night. Troops moved under cover of darkness. Radio silence was maintained. The goal was complete surprise. And the Italians, exhausted from the 11th Isonzo and confident that the Austro-Hungarians were too weak to launch a major offensive, suspected nothing. General Cadorna had received intelligence reports suggesting a possible attack, but he dismissed them. The Austro-Hungarians were beaten, he believed. They would not dare attack. If anything, he was planning another Italian offensive for later in the autumn, a 12th Battle of the Isonzo that would finally break through to Trieste. He was catastrophically wrong. In the early morning hours of October 24, 1917, the weather along the upper Isonzo Valley was miserable. A thick fog blanketed the valleys and lower slopes, reducing visibility to just a few dozen yards. Italian soldiers in their forward positions could see almost nothing. The fog muffled sound, creating an eerie, disorienting silence. At 2 a.m., that silence was shattered. The German and Austro-Hungarian artillery opened fire, not the prolonged, days-long bombardment that had become standard, but a short, intense, devastating barrage. For 4 hours, over 2,000 guns pounded Italian positions. High-explosive shells destroyed bunkers and trenches. Gas shells, many Italian soldiers lacked adequate gas masks or had masks that were defective, filled dugouts and valleys with choking clouds of phosgene. Italian soldiers, caught in their positions, suffocated in the gas or emerged from their dugouts only to be cut down by shrapnel. Communication lines were severed immediately. Italian artillery, targeted with precision by German counter-battery fire, was suppressed or destroyed. Command posts were hit. Within the first hour, the Italian Second Army's communications network had largely ceased to function. Corps commanders could not contact division commanders. Division commanders could not contact their regiments. The army was being blinded and paralyzed. At 6 a.m., still under cover of fog, the German and Austro-Hungarian infantry attacked. The Stormtrooper units moved forward rapidly, using the fog as concealment, bypassing Italian strongpoints that were still reeling from the bombardment. They advanced not in lines but in small groups, moving through valleys and along ridges, seeking weak points, exploiting any gap they found. Where they encountered resistance, they did not stop to fight. They went around it, leaving the position to be dealt with by following units. Their objectives were miles behind the front line: headquarters, supply dumps, artillery parks, road junctions. They moved with stunning speed, advancing several miles in the first few hours, far faster than anyone had thought possible in this terrain. Among the German units advancing that morning was a battalion of Württemberg mountain troops, the Württemberg Gebirgsbataillon, commanded by a young officer who would later become one of the most famous and infamous commanders of the 20th century, Lieutenant Erwin Rommel. Rommel, just 26 years old, led his battalion in a daring penetration deep behind Italian lines. Moving through fog and forest, his men captured an entire Italian artillery battery without firing a shot. The Italian gunners, cut off and surrounded, simply surrendered. Rommel's battalion then pushed on, climbing mountain paths, bypassing Italian positions, advancing nearly 10 miles in the first 24 hours and capturing over 8,000 Italian prisoners with minimal losses. It was the kind of bold, independent action that the infiltration tactics were designed to enable, and it was being replicated by dozens of other German and Austro-Hungarian units all along the front. By the end of October 24th, the Italian defensive line had not just been penetrated, it had been shattered. Entire divisions had lost contact with their headquarters. Units were surrounded, cut off, or in full retreat. The fog, which had provided cover for the initial German advance, now created chaos for the Italian defenders. Units retreating through the fog stumbled into enemy positions or were fired on by their own troops who could not identify them in the murk. General Capello, commanding the Second Army, tried to organize a defense, but he had no clear picture of the situation. Reports reaching his headquarters were fragmentary and often hours out of date. He issued orders for counterattacks, but the units designated to carry them out had already been overrun or were in retreat. The command structure was collapsing as rapidly as the front line. By nightfall on October 24th, it was clear that this was not just another battle, this was a catastrophe. The Italian Second Army, which had held this sector of the front for 2 years, was disintegrating. And the German and Austro-Hungarian forces, far from consolidating their gains, were pushing forward relentlessly, exploiting every opening, driving deeper into Italian territory with each passing hour. The breakthrough at Caparetto had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Now the question was whether the Italians could stop the advance before their entire army collapsed. The answer, in the days that followed, would be barely. In the days following October 24th, the situation on the Italian front descended from disaster into complete catastrophe. What had begun as a breakthrough in a single sector became a general collapse along the entire northern front. The Italian Second Army, which had borne the brunt of the initial attack, essentially ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. And behind the disintegrating army came something even more terrible, a flood of hundreds of thousands of refugees, fleeing before the advancing Central Powers forces, clogging the roads, overwhelming the rail system, spreading panic wherever they went. The collapse was not primarily a result of German and Austro-Hungarian military superiority, though their tactics had been brilliantly executed. The collapse was fundamentally a failure of morale and command. The Italian soldiers of the Second Army had endured 2.5 years of brutal mountain warfare, 11 failed offensives, appalling casualties, and treatment by their own command that bordered on criminal. They were exhausted, demoralized, and resentful. Many units had been on the verge of mutiny even before Caparetto. When the German attack struck with such devastating force, when communications broke down and officers lost control, when it became clear that the line was broken and retreat was the only option, many soldiers simply gave up. Entire divisions laid down their weapons and surrendered. Others broke ranks and fled toward the rear. Some officers tried to rally their men, but many soldiers ignored them or, in some cases, turned on them. The thread of discipline that Cadorna had maintained through terror and executions snapped completely. The army was not retreating in good order, it was disintegrating. General Cadorna, receiving reports of the disaster from his headquarters far behind the front, responded with characteristic rigidity and panic. He issued orders for counterattacks that could not be executed. He ordered units to hold positions that had already been overrun. He blamed his subordinate commanders for failing to carry out impossible orders. And critically, he delayed making the decision that should have been obvious from the first day, to authorize a general retreat to a defensible position before the entire army was encircled and destroyed. When Cadorna finally authorized the retreat on October 27th, 3 full days after the battle began, it was too late to conduct it in an organized manner. The Second Army was already in full flight. The Third Army, holding positions to the south, was now in danger of being cut off as German and Austro-Hungarian forces pushed westward behind them. The entire Italian defensive system along the Isonzo was collapsing. The scale of the disaster was staggering. In just the first week of the battle, over 293,000 Italian soldiers were captured. Not killed, not wounded, captured. Entire regiments marched into captivity, led by their officers, having surrendered without significant resistance. Many prisoners later reported that they were simply relieved the war was over for them, that captivity seemed preferable to continued service under Cadorna's brutal command. In addition to the prisoners, the Italians abandoned 3,152 artillery pieces, virtually the entire artillery park of the Second and Third Armies. They left behind thousands of machine guns, millions of rounds of ammunition, vast stockpiles of supplies. The Central Powers captured more war material at Caparetto than in any other single operation of the entire war. But the military disaster was compounded by a humanitarian catastrophe. As the Italian armies retreated westward from the Isonzo toward the Tagliamento and ultimately the Piave River, a distance of up to 100 miles, the roads became clogged with civilian refugees. These were the inhabitants of the Friuli region and the territories that had been under Italian control, Italians and Slovenians, families who had lived through 2.5 years of military occupation and were now fleeing before the advancing Austro-Hungarian and German forces. They took what they could carry: clothes, food, valuables, household goods loaded onto carts or carried on their backs. Old people, children, the infirm, all streaming westward in a desperate attempt to stay ahead of the advancing armies. The roads became nightmares of congestion. Military columns trying to retreat found their way blocked by refugee carts. Artillery batteries abandoned their guns because they could not move them through the crowds. Supply convoys trying to reach the front were swept backward by the tide of humanity flowing in the opposite direction. Units became separated from their commands, wandering lost, sometimes being overrun by fast-moving German forces before they even realized the enemy was that close. And always, behind them, came the Central Powers forces, advancing, pursuing, capturing stragglers and isolated units. The German Stormtrooper battalions, particularly, proved adept at deep penetration operations. Units like Rommel's mountain troops would appear suddenly miles behind what the Italians thought was the front line, capturing headquarters, seizing supply dumps, spreading panic and confusion. The retreat became one of the great traumatic experiences in Italian history. Veterans who survived it spoke of chaos unlike anything they had experienced in battle. Roads clogged with humanity, villages burning, soldiers and civilians mixed together in a desperate mob, discipline completely broken down, every man thinking only of survival. Some Italian units maintained discipline and fought effective rearguard actions, buying time for the retreat. The Bersaglieri, elite Italian light infantry, distinguished themselves in several engagements, holding river crossings long enough for other units to escape, then withdrawing in good order. But these were exceptions. For most of the Italian army, the retreat from Caparetto was simply a matter of moving westward as fast as possible and hoping to reach safety before being captured or killed. The question now was where the retreat would stop. The Tagliamento River, about 40 miles behind the original front line, seemed like a possible defensive position. But when Italian forces reached it in early November, they found that German forces had already penetrated so deeply that parts of the river line were already compromised. The retreat continued. The next major barrier was the Piave River, roughly 60 miles west of the Tagliamento. This was a more substantial obstacle, wider, faster flowing, with fewer crossing points. If the Italian army could reach the Piave and establish a defensive line there, they might be able to stop the Central Powers' advance. But if the Germans and Austro-Hungarians reached the Piave first, or forced crossings before Italian defenses could be organized, the entire Venice plain would lie open. Venice itself, the ancient maritime republic, might fall. But by early November, several factors were beginning to slow the Central Powers' advance. First, their supply lines were now stretched to the breaking point. The German and Austro-Hungarian armies had advanced so rapidly, up to 100 miles in less than 2 weeks, that their logistics could not keep up. Ammunition ran short. Food supplies dwindled. The troops themselves were exhausted from constant marching and fighting. Second, the terrain was working against them now. As they pursued the Italians westward, they left the mountain valleys where they had broken through and entered the broader plains of the Veneto, terrain that favored defense and where Italian advantages in manpower could be brought to bear more effectively. And third, the Italian command structure, which had collapsed so completely in the first days of the battle, was beginning to reconstitute itself. This was partly because of personnel changes at the top. On November 8, General Cadorna was dismissed as Commander-in-Chief, finally held accountable for the disaster, though he would spend the rest of his life blaming his subordinates and his soldiers rather than his own failures of leadership and judgment. Cadorna's replacement was General Armando Diaz, a less senior but more pragmatic and humane commander. Diaz immediately set about restoring discipline through positive leadership rather than terror, addressing soldiers' grievances, improving food and medical care, and most importantly, rebuilding trust between the ranks and the command. More immediately critical, Allied reinforcements began arriving. The French and British, alarmed by the scale of the Italian collapse and fearing that Italy might be forced out of the war entirely, rushed divisions to the Italian front. 6 French divisions and 5 British divisions arrived in late October and early November, along with their artillery and support units. These fresh, experienced troops provided a backbone around which Italian forces could reorganize. By mid-November, Italian forces, reinforced by their French and British allies, had established a defensive line along the Piave River. It was not perfect, there were gaps, vulnerable points, positions that were barely held. But it was a line, and it held. German and Austro-Hungarian forces, reaching the Piave, attempted to force crossings but were repulsed. Their offensive power, after 3 weeks of continuous advance, was spent. On November 19, 1917, after nearly 4 weeks of continuous operations, the Central Powers forces halted their advance. They had achieved an extraordinary victory, one of the most successful offensive operations of the entire war. They had destroyed an enemy army, captured 250,000 prisoners, advanced up to 100 miles, and inflicted a humiliation on Italy that shook the nation to its core. But they had not knocked Italy out of the war. The line on the Piave held. And that fact, more than any other, would determine the ultimate legacy of Caparetto. The defense of the Piave River in November 1917 marked a turning point not just in the Battle of Caporetto, but in the entire Italian war effort. The line held, barely, desperately, but it held. And in holding, it gave Italy time to recover, to reconstitute its shattered armies, and ultimately to survive the disaster. The defensive line was not solely an Italian achievement. The French and British divisions that had rushed to Italy's aid played a crucial role, particularly in the critical first days when the line was most vulnerable. French artillery provided firepower that the Italians had lost with the abandonment of thousands of guns during the retreat. British divisions held key sectors where Italian units were too disorganized or too exhausted to fight effectively. But beyond the immediate military factors, there was something else that kept the line from breaking, a fundamental shift in Italian morale and national consciousness. The disaster of Caparetto had shocked Italy in a way that no previous defeat had. This was not just another failed offensive, not just heavy casualties and minimal gains. This was national humiliation, enemy forces on Italian soil, hundreds of thousands captured, the army routed, refugees fleeing in terror. And paradoxically, this humiliation created something that years of Cadorna's brutal discipline had failed to create, a sense of national unity and collective purpose. Italians who had been indifferent to the war, who had seen it as a conflict of distant governments and imperial ambitions, now saw enemy armies occupying Italian territory, threatening Italian cities. Venetians, Tuscans, Romans, people who had felt little connection to the Friuli peasants suffering under military occupation or to the Alpine soldiers dying in the mountains, now felt that their Italy was threatened. The Italian government, recognizing this shift, began speaking not of imperial ambitions or territorial gains but of national survival. They spoke of defending Italian soil, of protecting Italian homes and families. And soldiers who had been demoralized by years of senseless offensives found a new motivation to fight, not for Cadorna's grandiose strategic visions, but for something more fundamental and more personal. General Diaz, the new commander-in-chief, understood this shift and used it. His orders emphasized defense of the homeland rather than abstract strategic objectives. He improved conditions for soldiers, better food, better medical care, more regular leave, fairer discipline. He removed incompetent officers and promoted those who had shown courage and leadership during the retreat. He built, gradually, a new Italian army, smaller than before, but more cohesive, more motivated, and more capable. Through the winter of 1917 to 1918 and into the spring, the line on the Piave held. The Central Powers launched several attempts to break through, most notably in June 1918 during the Battle of the Piave River, but each was repulsed. The Italian army, written off as destroyed just months earlier, fought with a determination that surprised even its allies. But what of the Central Powers? Why, having achieved such a stunning victory at Caparetto, had they failed to exploit it fully and knock Italy out of the war? The answer lies in the very nature of their success. The advance had been too rapid, too deep. The infiltration tactics that had worked so brilliantly in the initial breakthrough created problems in the exploitation phase. The Stormtrooper units that had penetrated miles behind Italian lines were now isolated, their supply lines stretched impossibly thin. The conventional infantry following behind could not move fast enough to consolidate the gains and create a solid defensive front. Moreover, the Central Powers, particularly Austria-Hungary, lacked the resources to sustain such an offensive indefinitely. They had committed their best troops, their most experienced commanders, and enormous quantities of ammunition and supplies to the Caparetto offensive. Once the initial momentum was spent, they had nothing left in reserve to renew the attack. The armies that reached the Piave were exhausted, undersupplied, and increasingly affected by the same morale problems that had plagued the Italian army before Caparetto. And so Caparetto stands in history as one of the great paradoxes of the First World War. It was, by any military measure, a catastrophic defeat for Italy, the worst defeat suffered by any nation on any front during the entire war, measured by prisoners taken and ground lost. The 293,000 prisoners, the 3,000 guns, the 100-mile retreat, these numbers represent one of the most complete tactical victories achieved by either side. And yet, strategically, Caparetto was a failure for the Central Powers. It did not knock Italy out of the war. It did not free up Austro-Hungarian troops for use on other fronts. It did not lead to a negotiated peace. Instead, it strengthened Italian resolve, brought Allied reinforcements to the Italian front, and ultimately contributed to Austria-Hungary's own exhaustion. 1 year after Caparetto, in October 1918, Italian forces launched a final offensive at Vittorio Veneto that would break the Austro-Hungarian army and lead to Austria-Hungary's surrender on November 3, 1918, before Germany itself surrendered. The army that had been routed at Caparetto delivered the decisive blow that knocked one of the Central Powers out of the war. This redemption became central to Italian memory of the war. Caparetto was not forgotten. It could not be forgotten. The trauma was too deep. But it was reframed as a moment of national awakening, a crucible through which Italy passed and emerged stronger. The phrase "the spirit of Caparetto" came to mean not the disaster itself but the national unity and determination that emerged from it. The Battle of Caporetto. October 24 through November 19, 1917. A battle of innovation, of collapse, of desperate retreat, and ultimate survival. A battle that nearly destroyed Italy, but which instead, paradoxically, may have saved it, by revealing weaknesses that could no longer be ignored, by removing failed leadership, and by creating, from the depths of humiliation, a sense of national purpose that had not existed before. A catastrophic defeat that led, ultimately, to victory. That is the strange legacy of Caparetto. Caparetto was an unparalleled military humiliation for Italy. The army lost over 300,000 men, captured, wounded, or killed, and abandoned nearly all its heavy equipment. It revealed a deep flaw in the nation's high command and the exhaustion of its soldiers. Yet, out of the disaster, came a remarkable resilience. The shock of defeat forced wholesale changes in leadership and strategy, and it galvanized the Italian people. Caparetto nearly broke the nation, but in doing so, it forged the spirit of Caparetto, a desperate unity that enabled the final stand on the Piave River. The immediate victor was the German Stormtrooper. The ultimate beneficiary was a newly resolved Italian state. If you want to understand how military genius can lead to catastrophic defeat, and how nations rebound from the abyss, make sure you subscribe to History of Conflicts. Hit that notification bell, and leave a comment below. We want to know, do you think General Cadorna's brutal command style contributed more to the collapse, or was the German infiltration tactics simply unstoppable? Thanks for watching.